Hi everybody and welcome to Viking Superpowers. My new book is available. It's up on Amazon now for pre-order. It releases on the 1st of May 2025. It's also available as a paperback or a soft cover starting from the 1st of May. You can't pre-order that, but 1st of May you can get in and buy it. The title of my book is Viking Superpowers, Way of Asgard. Do the Viking myths contain suppressed ancestral memories of ancient high technology and powerful spacefaring humanoids who colonized the north of the world? If you've been following my channel, you know lots of things that are going to be in the book, but I can assure you there is a mountain of evidence and interesting ideas that haven't been heard before that started off as initial ideas, but as I wrote the book and as I translated, I was really surprised how much I discovered, how much new evidence, new concepts came out of those words. My research in my book stands on the backs or the shoulders of many giants. Firstly, Eric von Daniken has to be mentioned. A dear man, a great man who is now 90, and I salute him. I read his Chariots of the Gods back in 1975, maybe a year or two earlier, but definitely 1975 I had read it, and I read more of his books. And his ideas stuck with me over the years, and even though I became a Christian pastor, and I was a very committed young Christian from the age of 12, had a near-death experience at 22 that brought me back into the church, ended up a lay pastor for a couple of years, and then moved away from the church and started thinking outside the box, you might say. But Eric's works and Eric's ideas stuck with me. I always thought there was something to it. There seemed to be a reasonable case for thinking that the human race could have been very advanced in the past. To me, there's also a real case for interstellar travel. I've never really bought into this idea that speed of light is a constant. Perhaps it is a constant in some ways in physics, but I also believe there's always ways around things, and as you will find in my book, there's many strange things go on in this universe that we don't understand. And one of the themes of my book is that we now, here in the 21st century, with our increasing AI sophistication, with the ease of knowledge that we have, the ease of access to knowledge and ancient knowledge like I've got written here in my library, we're the first people to be able to think new thoughts about things that even to our parents' generation just didn't make any sense. My parents, for instance, were in their 30s when the first satellites were going up. All this was quite new to them, and their grandparents' generation believed that it was impossible to go into space, and I guess some people believed it was somehow an offense against God to go up there or even go and have a look. But for us now, high tech, whether it's fantasy or science, is not that difficult to comprehend. We've had so many wonderful movies over the years that have realized, as in made real, outrageous concepts that certainly are impossible, but they're quickly becoming possible. So that's a big theme of my book, is that we're able to see now with our 21st century eyes things in the old Viking sagas and the Eddas, which is the poetic ancient stories, that didn't make sense to people right through 1,000 years since they were written, but to us they do. To us we can see things, and that's why I've written the book. Really, I've been retranslating the Norse, and I've been studying Icelandic and Old Norse for many, many years. And not only is there so many more resources to learn to read Norse, but ways to check on your translations, ways to delve into deeper meanings. And I've been finding so much that is in plain sight, but it's hidden behind mistranslations. The classic is the word heaven. The Norse word is himmel, and variations of that word, which literally just means the sky, and it does mean the upper sky, like loft or lopt. That means high up in the sky, but himmel has a sense of being up high in the sky, but it also has a sense of being out there where the planets are, where the stars are. That mysterious zone that nobody really had been until, 1958, 59, when the first satellite, or maybe it was 57, the first satellites went up. But we are in a special place. So what I've done is looked at words like Himmel, which is often translated as heaven, and thought that word heaven gives a false idea of a sort of a spiritual, mysterious other dimension where God is, or the gods. A fantasy, really. It defangs the stories. It turns the word heaven, turns the stories into fairy tales. And if you want to look in Old Norse dictionaries, you'll often find Himmel translated as heaven. But have a think about it. Does anyone you know use the word heaven? As in, isn't the heaven lovely today? I'd like to ascend to the heavens in a rocket. No one says that. It's sort of a bit of a schmelzy, poetic way of speaking. It was once a real word. It was once, a correct word to say the stars are in the heavens. But that hasn't been correct for a long, long time. So taking that tack, I just kept going into Norse and discovering over and over the most extraordinary words. And one of the great influences on me for this book is the professor of Old Icelandic at the University of Iceland, Professor Ármann Jakobsson, who I met when I went to Iceland and who very kindly introduced me to Professor Gunnlaugsson, who showed me the actual sagas, the handwritten, priceless manuscripts written around about 1300, originally written in the early 1200s. And my journey has been literary. And it's in the literature that I've discovered the most extraordinary possibilities. I'd like to read you an excerpt from my book. I think you'll find this tremendously interesting. This is what Snorri writes in chapter 2 of Ynglinga Saga at the start of Heimskringla. To the east of Tanakrisel, the great river Don in Asia, it was called Ausaland, or Ausaheimr, and the capital city that was in the land they called Asgard, Ausgarður. So that word Ausaland means the land of the Aesir, and Ausaheimr means the Aesir's world. In that town was the temple lord who was called Odin. There, in Asgard, was a great worship place. You might say a great temple. That was there the custom, that there were 12 temple chieftains. The Aesir were the people of Asia. I remember quite clearly when I first read this description in the Edda, thinking, what the heck? The Aesir came from Asia. I didn't expect that. I thought they came from Scandinavia. To an Australian like me, Asia means the great lands of the Far East. Upon doing some research, I learnt that Asia, according to the ancient Romans and others, begins in the area of Turkey, and that it is marked as Asia on the old maps. And I've actually seen those old maps online. Maps 100, 200 years old. They just label it Asia. Even today, it is still sometimes called Asia Minor. In Snorri's prologue to his prose Edda, he writes, and this is my translation of it, from the north and down the eastern half all the way to the south, that is called Asia, Ausia. In that half of the world is all exceptional beauty and splendour found, and all of the earth's fruits, gold and gemstones. There is located the middle of the world. Just as the land there is shiningly beautiful, and better in all qualities than other places, so too the people there were exalted for their almost magical abilities and powers, profound wisdom, physical strength, and paranormal power, and great physical beauty. Near the middle of the world was built that house and room. These words are hus, for house, and HERBERGI, for room, the greatest that has ever been. That is called Troy. There where we call Turkey. Okay, so that's the end of that translation. Now I write, calling it a house and a room seems decidedly odd. This is where a translator can dig deeper, looking for hidden meaning. So when I read Asgard, the great Asgard, which we all know from the Marvel movies, was called a house and a room, it seemed like, that doesn't really make sense. This is that last sentence in Old Norse. Nær mithri veroldni var gård that hus og herbergi ágætast hefir verið, kallat Troja, þar sem vér kollum Tyrkland. The word hus simply means a house, and one generally thinks of a house being perhaps small or perhaps quite large, but generally being one unit. In this context, however, as we are talking about these very unusual people, perhaps the use of this word is pointing towards the city being one gigantic unit, a house, but a house like no other. Now, this is a thought that I pursue quite a bit in the book. The next word, HERBERGI, that's H-E-R-B-E-R-G-I, HERBERGI, quite a challenge to the non-Icelander to get those R's rolling, is still used commonly in modern Icelandic and just means a room in a house. And I've known that probably the first lesson I did in Icelandic back in the 70s, that was one of the words I came across. This is why it did strike me as very odd. Why would HERBERGI relate to a massive city? However, when you break the word apart, you get two significant clues to a forgotten ancient meaning. The word her, I've put in brackets, sounds like hair, meaning army, and bergi, meaning shelter, protection, or mountain, a place for protection of an army or an army mountain. For me, this conjures up the idea of a military base buried under a mountain. Is it possible that Asgard, on the ground, and later in the book I talk a lot about Asgard in the sky, Asgard in outer space, I see Asgard as a ground base connected by a great star bridge, which I believe was what the tale of Yggdrasil, the world tree, is about, and also Bifrost, or Bifrost, the bridge that reaches from the ground up to Asgard in the sky. So I say, is it possible that Asgard on the ground could have been both a single very large city, in effect like a massive landed mothership, as well as containing a deeply buried military base covered by a mountain of rock? A herbergi protecting the inhabitants from potential massively powerful attacks, from weapons such as those we are able to deploy in our own time. A concept that really makes sense if we remember that the powerful ones visiting and ruling over Earth seem to have gone to war with each other at times. And this is also a big part of my book, and my friend Paul Wallace talks about this, and Mauro Biglino talks about this, about how these clashing powerful ones in ancient Middle East, the Elohim, Anunnaki, there's different names, but these ruling powers seem to have got together to have consultations, and they also seem to have got stuck into each other, as we say in Australia. The prologue, which is the first part of Heimskringla before Ynglinga Saga, says, "This city was built far larger than any before it, and with great technical skill in many ways, with no expense or material spared from the available resources. There were 12 kingdoms and one high king, and many nations were subject to each kingdom." Which is talking about a really big empire, really, all based around this Asgard in Turkey. "There were in the great city 12 chieftains or kings. These 12 chieftains / kings were above even the greatest men of the past in all manly virtues." Now that's interesting, because this is indicating these weren't just men. They were obviously like men. They were humanoid, and I make the case in the book. They were very long living. They had a therapy which was given to them by a goddess who was a Alsinjur, one of the Aesi, a female powerful one. In the sagas they call these Ithun's apples, And there's a very interesting story about Loki and flying and Ithlin's apples, which you'll hear about, and I have made a video about that in the past. Thinking about my previous idea that Asgard could have been one great single unit, a hus, a house, then this description of it being divided into 12 brings to mind the divisions of the hours on a clock. The number 12 is significant in many ways. There is something about this clock concept that suggests something else, something round. Perhaps a great mothership, an enormous round craft filled with thousands of rooms, a gigantic city that could move location if necessary. All told, these people, their Aesir, and their lands in the middle of the world, and their great city, on the ground and in space, are really pretty awesome. Now, when you buy my book, being interested in what I have to say and being interested in this whole huge subject of UFOs, paleo-contact, alternate ancient history, you will be quite blown out, I think, by what is in plain sight in these sagas. It is really incredible how many times I stopped and just had to wonder that I was discovering things that seemed to be so obvious, but there's so few people who can read Old Norse. Most students of Old Norse, of course, are reading older texts and translations. If they're lucky, they have somebody wonderful like Professor Jakobsson to teach them in Iceland. But as with the Bible, as with a lot of classic subjects, sometimes there are mistakes that get handed on, as well as, the right thing, which is the majority of things, really. But there are also mistakes that get handed on from teacher to student and goes on. And that word heaven, as I mentioned before, is a classic that the dictionary, this one, Zoega's Icelandic English Dictionary, this is one of the books that everyone has used for 100 years, and it's the one that constantly translates him in as heaven. I don't suppose anyone's ever looked at Hus and HERBERGI and thought, I assume that most people just skip over that because, sometimes you do that in old myths. You think, they're just a bit odd and that doesn't really mean anything, It's not until you actually start on a bit of a program to discover new meaning, to discover an alternate meaning, that you look at things. It's a bit like the other day I was looking for a special book up here and I couldn't find it. It was right in front of my eyes, but it's got a black cover and it just was invisible. And that's how it often is with things. You're so used to them that you don't question them. Now, to give you an idea of where I got all this from, there's two books. This book and this book. So, and not to forget this book. So, I've talked about these a little bit in previous videos, but these are the Bibles, if you will, of Old Norse mythology. I don't want to call it a religion. We don't really know whether there was a religious sort of take on this rather than a spirituality. It's a different subject, but because Christianity from the start was a literate religion and organized by the Romans, who were very organized, we tend to think of religions as things that are text-based. They got a book, it's all collated and labelled, and you can find the exact phrase, Numbers chapter 5, verse 27, that sort of thing. And you've got the beliefs, you've got doctrines, you've got dogmas, you've got things that everyone is supposed to believe. It's sort of the start of mass production, you might say. Whereas for people like the people of the Viking Age and earlier, pre-literate, except for some, pretty amazing runic writings, everything was sort of done through poetry, through memory, through stories passed on one to the other. And they are remarkably conservative in that, the stories have lasted for thousands of years. I'm convinced that this is another great part of my book, is looking at the rock carvings in ancient Sweden and Denmark, some in Norway. Sweden's where the great mass of them are, but Bronze Age, 2000 AD through to 2000 BC through to 500 BC. This pictographic language, it's astounding. And I'll leave it for another video to talk about what I call the smoking guns that I discovered in those ancient carvings. But what's in there, and then you look at the stories in the sagas and the Eddas, it's quite mind-boggling because there's thousands of years between them, but they seem to be telling the same tale. So of the two books, this one is Snorri Sturluson's. It's in Icelandic, it's Edda Snorra Sturlusonar. That means the Edda of Snorri, the son of Sturla, Kvam Sturla, and he plays a significant part in the story too. That's also another video, because I really believe Snorri was telling the truth. I don't believe he was a Christian. I'll be talking more about this, but I don't. Everyone accuses him that this is another scholarly thing. There's a tradition of saying that he was a Christian and that what he wrote can't be really relied on because he was trying to bolster up the Christian religion and convince his fellow Icelanders and I guess other Scandinavians to reject the old ways. I think complete opposite is the truth. But anyway, that's what we call the prose Edda. When I was young, in the 70s and 80s, it tended to be called the Younger Edda. They've given up calling it that. It's a bit confusing. This is actually older than this one. This one's Saemundar Edda, which is a really old-fashioned way to call this. This is now called the Poetic Edda. I'll be delving much deeper into this book in my next book, but there's some stories from here that feature significantly in Viking Superpowers' Way of Asgard, particularly the story of Voland the elf, who was also called Wayland the Smith in English tradition, also called Velent, Velent, in Thithrek's Saga af Beren, which is a sort of a German Danish, I guess, saga that has this awesome story about Voland the elf and his flying machine, and I can reveal it, I've discovered a submarine in that story. Like really, it's got to be a submarine or a USO. All that stuff's in there. You're going to be amazed by what's in my book, really. It's a game changer, if I must say myself. For a first book, I think it's a good one. I've tried my best to make it readable, to make it intelligent, to make it balanced. You know, I'm not an extremist. I'm not ranting at you saying this is the absolute truth and you must believe it and this is the new religion of all us Viking lovers. That's why it's so important to me to actually rehabilitate the stories in these books, because people, even if they're into them, they still treat them like fantasies, like fairy tales, because they don't understand. They sort of look at it and think, I can't really find a realistic thing in here. What they say is they accuse Snorri not only of being a Christian, but taking this historical tack, which is called euhemerism, where he purposely and deceitfully turns the stories of gods, powerful beings, into human kings who are sort of deified. And the last book, and there's deep resources behind me, like I don't even know yet what I'm going to find in there. It's so deep. You know, my friend Colonel Alexander, when I first told him about this project, he said, this is good, Dave. He said, this is a road less travelled, and it is. There's a whole gold mine of paranormal and paleo-contact information buried in Icelandic, in Old Norse, and a lot of books that are written in modern Icelandic by scholars that reveal things, and when you get into it, it's like, oh, never come across this in English. So the last book I'll show you is this wonderful book. It's called Heimskringla. That's actually number 2. So there's 3 of them. Heimskringla 1, 2 and 3. And these are the classic series called Icelandic Fornrit. And if you are into Icelandic, you'll notice that they use a Z, a Z. Icelandsk. And I learnt Icelandic from a linguaphone course that was set up in 1955, but it was based on a book from 1944. So for me, the Z was normal, and you still find it all the time, the Z or the Z in Old Norse. But when you talk to modern Icelanders, oh no, we don't use that. So it's because they got rid of it in the 70s. Didn't tell me about it. I had to find out the hard way. But this wonderful book, Heimskringla, this is the Snorri's masterwork, 3 great volumes, the history of the Norse Kings. And my take on it is that he treats these stories of gods, which are in the prologue, which is called Prologus, and in the Ynglinga Saga, he treats them just as historically, just as seriously as things that really happened, as he treats the later stories of, the Christian kings of Scandinavia, and, the pre-Christian, but certainly very historical kings, Harold Fairhair and people like that. He treats these stories of the gods, the Aesir, as what we call fair dinkum in Australia, as truth, as real. Yeah, I'm really very attached to these stories now, and I do believe what I'm talking about is probably real. And I start the book with an introductory chapter that I hope you'll enjoy, talking about all the whistleblowers and top level military and connected people who've come forth over the last 20 or 30 years and stated not only is there a presence here that is either extraterrestrial or crypto-terrestrial or interdimensional, but it's been here for a very long time. And that's what I focus on in that first chapter, is the stories about them being here for a very long time. Because once you've got that out there, then that's then putting this idea that there could be stories about high-tech people, either very high-tech humans from a previous civilization, forgotten now, or people from somewhere else, very high-tech people. It makes it much more legitimate when, high-level people are saying, we think they've been here for a very long time, 10,000 years or much more. That makes you then reassess these ancient stories with that eye that maybe they were telling the truth. Maybe Snorri was telling the truth. Maybe he wasn't a Christian, and I don't think he was, as I said, and I go deeply into that in my chapter. I believe Snorri. I really believe that these stories are profound, and I'm very happy to be doing what I'm doing, and I've got some really fantastic allies, and I want to thank them, and I want to thank you. You're the most important people. I really thank you. I know I've got a lot of supporters who always write to me, always comment. You keep me going. Your comments and your well wishes, the fact many people have written, said, I'm buying your book, don't you worry about that. It delights me because I love conversation, I love people, and I think this is an exciting field. It's like being an explorer in a new land, discovering things that no one's seen before. Okay, I'll leave it at that, and I'll see you next time.